chapter 22. And by way of reminder here, Paul has come back to Jerusalem, has delivered the offering, and as a result of trying to not really make amends, but kind of to appease the confusion and the misunderstandings of the Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem, had agreed to go to the temple. And while he's there at the temple, the unbelieving Jews saw him there, got angry, mob formed. He was beaten, arrested, turned over to the Romans. And now the Romans, the captain there, has given him opportunity to make a speech to this mob. And we talked about this last week, that he was really trying to make two fundamental points in this speech. And the first was, I was at one point just like you. I was as zealous for the law as you. I zealously, and we'll see this today, persecuted the Christians. I felt the same way about Christianity as you. But then Christ stepped in. I was converted. I was changed. And because of that, now I understand who Christ is. And so I was as zealous as you, and now the things that I do are done in obedience to God. So those are the two main points that he's been trying to make, and he's going to continue to develop these here in our text this morning, and we'll see their reaction to this. And so in chapter 22, starting in verse 17, this is still Paul speaking, and he said, "And it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste, and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of the martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles." In verse 22 it says, "And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices, and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle, and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. And then the chief captain came, and he said unto him, Tell me, art thou Roman? And he said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn. And then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. And the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. And on the morrow, because he would have known the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So we'll look at that story next week. But so here, as I said, Paul is continuing his defense. And we talked about last week how the rest of the book of Acts is going to contain several of these, what we call apologetic defenses, these apologetic speeches where Paul is defending himself. And so he's continuing this particular speech to that mob that had him arrested. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, thus far, he has shown his zealousness for the law prior to his conversion, and that all he does now is done in obedience, as I said in verse 14, to the God of our fathers, right? So he's trying to get solidarity with this group to show them, I'm not the guy that you think I am. I'm not the guy that you're trying to condemn. And you know, there's not an animosity between us. Maybe from you to me, but not from me to you. And everything that I do now, I'm doing in obedience to the God, again, as I mentioned several times last week, that you claim to worship. And so he has given them both undeniable and provable. And remember, he last week he mentioned the men who were with him as he was going to Damascus, the men who saw and heard the things that he saw and heard. They could prove and verify he's not lying. This actually happened. And beyond that, he was going to Damascus with letters from the Sanhedrin. Again, you could go to the Sanhedrin and they could verify, yes, they did in fact send me. And so he's given them undeniable and provable claims that he's not the man they have accused him of being. However, their animosity, not towards him, but their animosity towards the Gentiles proves too much to overlook Paul's relationship with the Gentiles, and it did not matter to them whether or not it was God who made it happen. And so this is kind of what we're going to see unfold in our text this morning. And so again, verse 17, he's still continuing to kind of give what we would refer to as his testimony. And so verse 17, and it came to pass that when I was coming into Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. And so Paul has been recalling for them his conversion. For the second time in the book of Acts, there will be one other time where that takes place. And so he's recalling for them his conversion, and he's told them how Jesus came to him on his way to Damascus, and as he said, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And as we talked about, this happened at noon, and so this light was literally outshining that of the sun. He told them how Jesus sent a devout and a respected Jew in the man Ananias to come and heal his sight after he met with Jesus. And that now he has been converted. His whole life, his desires, his perspectives, all of these things have changed from where he was zealous against Christianity now to being zealous for Christianity. And again, the whole point is Paul putting himself in the shoes of the people who were calling for his own death and saying, I was you. I was as zealous as you, even more so, right? Because I was successful in persecuting the church. I was dragging people to prison. As we'll see here in a minute, I was beating them. And so if I could go from that to what I am now, the question must be begged, what would cause that, right? What would bring somebody like you to become somebody like me? And so they have to ask themselves this. No, they don't. And we'll see, as we just read, ultimately they don't even let them finish speaking. But that's Paul's aim here. And so he's still serving the God of our fathers, as I mentioned a while ago, but now he sees and knows the truth of who that God is. And that's what separates Paul from that crowd, right? Everybody in that group that day, the mob and Paul would have said, we worship and serve God, but only Paul was in that crowd that day, knew and understood who that God actually was and was worshiping and serving him in the proper manner. And so Paul then tells them of the first time that he came to Jerusalem after his conversion. Now, we talked about this way back in chapter 9. I know it's been forever ago. But the details of that particular trip, it seems to be, if we piece together Paul's life, that didn't happen until maybe even a couple of years after his actual conversion. But how long after it takes place doesn't matter. He's just saying, this is the first time that I came to Jerusalem after being converted. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and he says he's in the temple. He's praying in the temple, and he was in a trance. And so interestingly enough, Paul has this particular vision, or this trance. I think it was a vision. Paul has this vision while he's praying in the temple. And why that matters is because speaking against the temple was one of the false accusations the Jews made against Paul. He's speaking against this place. We saw that earlier in the chapter. And so he was telling them, I haven't been blaspheming the temple. Even after my conversion, I was still going to the temple to pray. Right? And so I'm not blaspheming the temple. I was still honoring the temple. Obviously, it took on a much different meaning. Paul understood that no longer do I have to bring a lamb for my sacrifices. That's been taken care of. Christ has done that once and for all. But there was not a blaspheming of the temple. There was still an honor there for the temple. And so far from speaking against the temple, Paul is actually, after his post-conversion, still coming to the temple to pray. Now, that could have just been habit. I mean, he spent his whole life doing that. And so it could have just been habit, but what it does show is that it wasn't something that Paul was blaspheming. And now in this particular vision, as Paul is there at the temple praying, he receives this vision from Jesus, and Jesus tells Paul, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. Now Jesus specifically, it is Jesus himself, tells Paul that the Jews are not going to receive the truth about him. Now some would, most wouldn't. The same that is true then is the same that is true today. Most Jewish people alive today are not going to receive Christ for who he is. Some will. Thank God for them. And some do, but most won't. That has been true ever since Christ's resurrection. And remember, we have to remember this. We have to keep this in the context. This is the same Jesus who was the just one that Ananias spoke about. This is the same Jesus who came to Saul on his way to Damascus with the glorious light from heaven. This is the same Jesus who outshone the sun in his glory, right? And all that to say, this is not just Jesus the rabbi. This is not just Jesus the teacher. This is not just Jesus the miracle worker. This is Jesus, God in the flesh. That is this Jesus. And so he was and he is God. He knew the Jews would never accept that fact. Again, most. Some will, some do, but most won't. Now, furthermore, he knew that not only would the Jews not accept this, but the Jews would be hostile to this message, and that they would try to silence those that would propagate it. Obviously, he knows this as he's God, but he knows this, and he's warning Paul about it here. Now, he tells Paul to flee. As I said, we talked about that back in chapter 9. I won't rehash all those details, but Paul does, and he does so with the help of the brethren there in Jerusalem. But they do get him to escape Jerusalem before any problems could be had. Now, Paul didn't understand this. He almost, I don't want to say he argues with Jesus here. That's not what he's doing. He's just trying to understand what Jesus is telling him here. And so you see that after Jesus tells him, right, you need to get out of Jerusalem, verse 19, Paul said, Lord, they know that I am imprisoned and beat, or that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And so Paul doesn't understand this. At first he's saying, Jesus tells him, you got to get out of there because they're not going to believe you when you tell them the things about me. And Paul, he doesn't understand. He says, why would they not believe me? They know who I was. They know the things that I did. And so it should just be a logical conclusion to assume that if I could go from that to this, something big had to happen. Something big had to take Saul of Tarsus and make him the Apostle Paul. Right? Something big had to have happened. And honestly, the only thing that could have done that would have been a work of God. They'll see this. They'll know this. And so he's, again, I don't want to say he's arguing with Jesus. He's just trying to understand why the Jewish people would be so hostile to Paul's message specifically. Not just the message of the gospel, but Paul's testimony, considering they knew exactly who he was prior to his conversion. And so he clearly thought that they would understand his position. He thought that they would see that it must have taken God himself to take him from what he was to what he had become. And so Paul tells Jesus in this conversation, he says, they know that I imprisoned the Christians. They know that I went into synagogues. And he says, and I beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And so this is an interesting note here. This is the first time we've seen this. Earlier in the book of Acts, we know that Paul was arresting Christians and bringing them back to be imprisoned. But this is the first time we see that Paul was actually himself physically beating, or at least taking part in the beatings of Christians prior to his conversion. And all this adds to the level of the ominous nature of Paul's conversion. Right? Paul persecuted the church. All the Christians prior to Saul's conversion, they know the name Saul of Tarsus. They understand that he is a persecutor of the church. They understand that if Saul comes into town, that only means bad things for Christians in that particular town. And so he had this reputation. And so Paul was not only well known by the Christians, but his point is he was well known by the Jews who were rooting him on. I'm just as known by the Christians as I am by the Jews who are on my side. They're agreeing with me. They like the things that I'm doing to the Christians. And so he gives this example in verse 20. He says, and when the blood of the martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. Again, Paul's whole argument is, why would they not see this? Why would they not understand that the guy who's doing that is not the same guy now, and that thus there had to have been this amazing work of God to change them? And so he uses Stephen's death as kind of the defining picture of this. And so Saul, he was so much on the side of the Jews that he was the one standing by, holding the coats of the ones who stoned and made the first Christian martyr in Stephen. And so as zealous as Paul was, the interesting thing about all this, as zealous as Paul was prior to his conversion, he had either forgotten or never fully understood the extent of the hatred that existed by the most extreme Jews toward the Christians. And so as zealous as he was, it seems like even he didn't understand the fullness of that hatred that existed. And so this vision is information that we didn't get when Luke told us of Paul's conversion in chapter 9. And so we get a little bit more information now because it's pertinent to the conversation that's being had. It's pertinent to Paul's situation now. And so we get a little bit more information. Paul has a distinct purpose in telling it now. And I'll quote here John Phillips. He says, what Paul was attempting to do by making this pointed reference to his own past career as a determined persecutor of the church and by reminding his listeners of the active part he had played in Stephen's martyrdom, must have been clear enough to his listeners. He was trying to get them to realize, knowing his record as many of them did, that he must have had some convincing reasons for changing his ways. If that is what Paul hoped to accomplish, he was soon disillusioned, for with his next words, the storm broke. And so let's look at that. So Paul is continuing, again, the impression that we get here by Luke is that Paul had much more to say. I think Paul was probably going to give a much more pointed gospel presentation. Now, what he has done is enough to show this particular group that Jesus who you killed, he is the Messiah because he is God, right? And so there was enough there for them to understand at least part of the gospel, right? There was enough. But I think the plan there from Paul was to go into much more detail on this. He just never got the chance. Because we see here in verse 21, Paul speaking, he says, "And he said unto me," he being Jesus, "Depart, for I will send thee far hence into the Gentiles." That's as far into this speech as Paul was able to get. Because it's at that point that they begin to, scream out and cry. And we'll look at that in just a second. And so Paul then reveals Christ's plan for him. Right? So Jesus has come to him. He's praying in the temple. He's given this vision. Jesus is speaking. And he tells them all this, and he says, not only do you need to flee from Jerusalem, but I have plans for you. My plans for you is that you're going to go far hence unto the Gentiles. Now, let me just say just a little bit about this. Now, God had a special calling for Paul. Paul is often referred to as the apostle to the Gentiles. Right? So you have Peter, James, and John, who are kind of often seen as the apostle to the Jewish people, but then you have Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentiles. Just because Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles does not mean that he was not also an apostle to the Jewish people. And so God had a special calling for Paul, one that would include, and I would even say one that would emphasize, Paul's apostleship to the Gentiles. However, we have seen throughout the ministry of Paul that even though he was sent unto the Gentiles, it was never, and I've said this many times in this study, but it was never to the exclusion of the Jewish people. Right? Paul was not sent to the Gentiles never to preach to, speak to, or try to reach the Jews again. Right? And as we've seen over and over and over again in Paul's 3 missionary journeys, the very first thing he would do in every city he went to, if there was a synagogue, that's where he went first. Every city that Paul has gone to, he has tried to reach his own people. Every city that Paul has gone to, the Jewish people have held a special place in his heart, and he's tried to give them the gospel. He's tried to reach them, and he's been somewhat successful. There have been Jewish people who have been saved. It was Paul, and I've mentioned this several times already, but it was Paul who not long before this event wrote to the Romans, "If it were possible, I would cut myself off from the covenant with God so that the Jewish people could be entered into it." Right? This is the same Paul. And so he was never the apostle to the Gentiles to the exclusion of the Jews. It was as Jesus, or rather Ananias told him earlier, that he would be sent to all people. That's what Ananias told him. It's not just the Jews. You're going to be sent to everybody. He says in verse 15, "Thou shalt be his witness unto all men." That was the calling of Paul. And so what verse 21 emphasizes is not necessarily that Paul was going to the Gentiles. What verse 21 is emphasizing is that he would go to the Gentiles who were far away. That's what verse 21 is emphasizing. You're not just the apostle to the Gentiles. You are going to be sent far off to the Gentiles. And we've seen that happen. We've seen the fulfillment of that. We've seen Paul go all over the Roman Empire. We've seen Paul make his way into Europe. Paul had plans to go to Spain. We know that. We've talked about this. And so we have seen mostly the fulfillment of this over Paul's 3 missionary journeys, and the rest of the book of Acts is going to see him go even farther. Even though he's going in chains, he's still going. Right? Even though he's going to be in chains and in prison and going to Rome for the purposes of defending himself in a court of law, he's still going to Rome. And he's still getting the opportunity to preach the gospel. He's still getting the opportunity to see people come to know Christ. And so that is the emphasis, that he was going to go far and spread the gospel, see people saved, see churches started, and Paul did that everywhere he went. Now, like I mentioned, I think Paul had a whole lot more to say. He just never got the opportunity to say it. Because at that word that he was being sent far away to the Gentiles, verse 22 says, "And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." We've talked a great deal, not just in the book of Acts, but I went through the book of Mark a while back, and we've seen the hostility that the Jewish people had for the Gentiles, and I don't want to claim that that's a one-way street. The Jewish people also had a lot of hostility to the Jews. There was a lot of animosity one for the other. But here we see kind of the extent of that, as Paul saying that Jesus himself told me that I was going far away to the Gentiles. That was enough for them to say, we've heard enough. And think about this. They have heard Paul claim that Jesus was God. That's the same Jesus who they crucified. But they still let him talk after that. They still let him keep going. When they stopped him was that when he said, that man who I'm saying is God told me to go to the Gentiles. That's when they said, no, enough is enough. You can claim that he is God. We may disagree, but that's fine. We will not let you say that God is sending you to the Gentiles. And so this was enough for them to end the speech. And so think about the implications of what Paul has said. And I want you to kind of get some perspective on this. He has told them that Jesus is God. He hasn't said those three words exactly, Jesus is God, but those are the implications of what he said. And so this means that not only have the Jewish people missed out on the Messiah that they have waited for their entire lives, that have been prophesied for centuries, not only have they missed out on the Messiah, but it also means that they literally had God put on a cross and crucified him, right? That doesn't put you in a good light. They don't like that. And then secondly, that Jesus, as God, is sending his chosen man to the Gentiles. Meaning, the implication of this is that God has a plan for the dogs just as he has for the Jews. And I say it that way because that's how they commonly refer to the Gentiles, as dogs. And that's the way they saw them, as dirty, unclean, and not necessarily worthy of covenant with God. And so in no way does this justify their actions. That's not what I'm trying to do. But it does help us understand why they do what they do. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of understanding. And so they're not willing to accept this. They're not willing to accept that God, first of all, that Jesus was God, and they're not able to accept that God in the flesh, Jesus, would send a Jew to go give that particular covenant promise to Gentiles. And so they say, away with such a fellow from the earth, it is not fit that he should live. They're not just calling for his arrest. They're not just calling for him to be punished. They're calling for him to be killed. And so they don't just want Paul silenced. They want Paul dead. Right? This is the degree of their animosity. And so they continue their cries of away with such a fellow. Away with him. And so they were saying that before his speech. They're saying it now that he's anchored them in his speech. Away with him. And why this is relevant or important is because this is the same thing that a crowd, an angry mob of Jews, and again, we don't know, but perhaps there were some in this mob that day who were in the very mob that yelled the same thing with Jesus. And so just like they had done with Jesus, the one that Paul claimed was God in the flesh, the one they too wanted, not just silenced, but dead. They said the same thing. We read in John chapter 19. It says, he said, he being Pilate, he saith unto Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And so the exact same thing that they said to Jesus is the same thing that they're saying with Paul at this particular moment. The crowd then, now remember, they're already a mob. They've already acted like a mob. To recall the events, the Roman soldiers who arrested Paul had to literally carry him up the steps of the fortress because the mob kept, gathering around them when we were trying to get at Paul. And so this crowd begins to get even more belligerent. We see this in verse 23. And as they cried out, they cast off their clothes and they threw dust into the air. And so they begin to just kind of throw their cloaks on the ground and been, grabbing dust and tossing it into the air. Now, I saw a lot of discussions about what these actions symbolized, because that's what they're doing. These are symbolic actions. And then I saw a lot of discussion about what they symbolize, but it seems to be that these are symbolic actions to say that something extremely offensive was just said, that they were offended by what Paul said, and so they're throwing dust in the air, they're tossing their cloaks off as a manner to show the great offense that was just taken by what Paul had said. Now, either way, no matter what it meant, the crowd was moving in such a way that the captain, the Roman captain of this cohort, he knows, I have to step in now. He knows that no longer can I allow him to try and calm this crowd. No longer can I allow him to speak. Time to act has just come on. And so he interjects. He comes in, verse 24. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And so it seems, it's interesting, that the captain himself was confused why this crowd was acting in this way. He didn't even understand. Right? He said that he should be examined that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And so the captain, watching this unfold, he's totally at a loss. He doesn't understand why they're acting in such a way. Now, we don't know exactly why he's confused. Maybe he didn't understand their gestures of ripping off their clothes and throwing dust in the air. I think maybe it's even more likely that he doesn't speak Hebrew, and Paul has been saying this speech in Hebrew. And so he's listening to Paul speak, probably not understanding what he's saying. He's seeing this mob react in such a aggressive and violent manner. And so he knows that he's got to step in, and he has to know what Paul said to make them react in such a way. And so either way, he brings in Paul with the intention of scourging him. Essentially, he's hoping to torture the truth out of Paul. Now, again, we see parallels between Paul and Christ. Because not only did the crowd cry away with him to Jesus, but Pilate had Jesus scourged. That's exactly what the captain here is intending to do with Paul. And so, they bring Paul back, verse 25, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion that stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned?" There is probably nothing else in that moment that Paul could have said that would have instilled more fear into those Romans than saying what he just said right there. And so as they're preparing to have Paul scourged, he asked not just any soldier, he asked a centurion, right? Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? Those two things right there would have instilled fear in every Roman soldier present. Now, let me explain some things here. Roman citizens had certain protections that other people living under Roman rule did not. And so, just so we understand, just because you were ruled by Rome did not make you a Roman citizen, right? There was a special class for Roman citizens. Not everybody who lived under Roman rule was a Roman citizen. And so, there were certain protections, certain things that Roman citizens had that non-citizens did not have. I'll give you a quote here. This is by the famous Roman statesman Cicero. If you've ever heard of Cicero, Cicero once wrote this. He says, "To bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him is an abomination," and scourging is flogging. "To flog him is an abomination. To slay him is almost an act of murder. To crucify him is" what? "There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed." And so they had certain protections built in. If you're a Roman citizen, you could be punished. You could even be killed. But there were certain means that could not be used upon a Roman citizen. Scourging, crucifixion were a couple of those. You could not do that to them. And so here, Paul has not only been bound, but he was about to be flogged. He was about to be scourged. Both of which carry a penalty for those who are carrying it out if it was ever proved that Paul was, in fact, a Roman citizen. And so what happened is, just from a historical perspective, people basically took it on face value. If somebody said, "I am a Roman citizen," it was believed. Because to make the claim that you're a Roman citizen, if it were found out that you were not a Roman citizen, you could be greatly punished just for making the claim that you were. And so for Paul to make the claim that he was a Roman citizen in this particular setting, they just knew that this had to be true. There's no other reason why he would make such a claim. And so the centurion knows the seriousness of this, and then he goes and he tells the captain, he says, "Take heed what thou doest, because this man is a Roman." Immediately, everything that was about to happen is shut down. And so the centurion goes to the captain and says, "Hey, you better watch out. You better think about this real hard for a second, because he's a Roman." Now, I want to say this before we move on. It is true that we as Christians are called to suffer for the cause of Christ. It is true that there are times in our Christian walk where there is a necessary suffering that is involved with our obedience to Christ. In fact, we have recently, Paul had recently written to the Roman church, "The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and of children then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may be also glorified together." And so not long before these events, Paul writes to the Romans that we need to suffer with him so we can be glorified together with him. Furthermore, in Acts chapter 9, when Jesus sends Ananias to heal Paul, he tells Ananias to tell Paul, "For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake." The reason I bring this up is because there's been some people who said, Paul shouldn't have done this. Paul should have endured this scourging. Paul should have endured for the cause of Christ. Paul should have just accepted what was coming to him, because clearly if it was coming, it was God's will for it to happen. And there are some who say Paul shouldn't have opened his mouth. He should have just let it be. However, I want to add to this. Yes, we have been called to suffer. We have been called to endure. We have been called to patience. All of these things are true and good and right for the Christian. However, we have never been called to endure needless suffering. We have never been called to invite suffering. We have never been called to say, if there is a logical and legal means to escape suffering, don't you dare take it, because you better suffer just because suffering for suffering's sake is good. No, that's never what we see in Scripture. And so, in other words, it was not wrong for Paul to appeal to his citizenship to avoid being scourged. He has faced a whole lot of persecution for the cause of Christ. He's been beaten. He's been shipwrecked. He's been imprisoned. He's been in chains. He's been rejected. All of these things that Paul has already endured for the cause of Christ, and he's going to face a whole lot more. Again, Paul is going to be martyred for his beliefs. He doesn't have to let somebody torture him, especially when he has a legal right to avoid it. And so Paul, in other words, he doesn't have to go looking for ways in which to endure suffering for Christ. Right? Suffering for Christ, when it can't be avoided, is a good thing for a Christian to do. We don't need to go looking for ways to suffer for Christ. Those ways will typically come as they will. And so I completely agree with G. Campbell Morgan. He said, "Some might say, ought he not to have suffered? No. Martyrdom is only of value when it cannot be avoided. A cheap martyrdom never produces any great result." In other words, we don't have to go looking for it. We don't have to invite it into our life. We endure it when it comes. We endure it when it's inescapable. But God is not calling us to go looking for ways to be tortured and to suffer for His name's sake. If it's brought on upon us and we endure it because it's inescapable, that is what brings God the most glory. And so Paul here, he's under no compulsion, biblically or under the Spirit, to endure this. There's no reason why he shouldn't have called out his Roman citizenship here. And so the captain then, he comes to Paul and he asks, is this true? He's just doing his due diligence, what he should have done. And finding out that it is true, he says, "With a great sum obtained I this freedom." So again, just a little history lesson here. This man had at some point bought a Roman citizenship. And this was something that was available at certain points during the Roman Empire. Certain people could buy or purchase a citizenship, and it was not cheap. Likely, now we don't know this for a fact, but likely this man purchased his citizenship when Claudius was emperor. Now we find out in the next chapter, in chapter 23, verse 26, that this captain's name is Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias. Now Lysias is a Greek name, but Claudius is a Roman name. So we know that this man is a Greek, but he has a Roman name. And so it was not uncommon for somebody to take on the name of the Roman emperor when they purchased that citizenship. And so here he purchased his citizenship, again, maybe under Claudius, maybe not, but at some point he definitely did. But Paul responds, he says, "But I was freeborn." Now Tarsus, Paul says he was from Tarsus. He had already told the Roman captain that he was from Tarsus. Tarsus was a free Roman colony, but it was a free colony. It was not a Roman colony, meaning the captain would not have known that he was a citizen just because he was from Tarsus. There were certain places that were Roman colonies. if I'm not mistaken, I think Philippi was one of those. And so if you were from Philippi, if you were born in Philippi, you were a natural-born Roman citizen. Tarsus was not one of those. And so just because he knew us from Tarsus doesn't necessarily mean he was a Roman citizen. And so at some point, either most likely Paul's father or grandfather had done something for some Roman official, or some service had been offered by them to the empire that granted them citizenship. And so that when Paul was born, he was born with natural-born Roman citizenship. And so he was granted to him at birth. Why any of this matters? Why even bring any of this up? Is because a free-born Roman citizen was more respected than somebody who had bought their citizenship. And I just I quoted a few earlier from Cicero. It's a crime to bind a Roman, right? Why would you ever flog him? You can't do anything. You can't do these things to Roman citizens. And a free-born Roman citizen was more respected than the one who had bought their citizenship. And so here is Paul, a free-born Roman citizen, having been bound uncondemned, has not been charged with anything, bound uncondemned, and about to be scourged by a man who had purchased his citizenship. This would have been seen as highly disrespectable and completely against the status quo. And so this would have been something that, if found out, that captain, Claudius Lysias, could have faced a lot in his life, probably lost his own citizenship, and faced even further crimes and punishment, because doing this to a freeborn would have been seen as the highest degree of shame. And so this is why we read in verse 29. He says, "Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him, and the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him." This terrified Claudius Lysias here, because he knew, I'm not a natural-born citizen, and this guy is. And again, he stands here uncondemned and bound and about to be scourged. This was a big deal, and this guy could have faced a lot of trouble had he gone through with this. And so, however scared he might have been, at the end of the day, he still needs to know why these things were going on. He still has to keep the peace. He still has to make sure that Jerusalem is running smoothly. He still has to make sure that none of the problems and issues of what's taking place right now ever make it back to Rome, because his job is to keep the peace. And so he still needs to know what's going on. And so this leads us to verse 30, which says, "On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty, wherefore they accused him, he loosed him from his bands." So Paul is still kind of detained, but under less harsh situation. And so he loosed him from his bands, and he commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and he brought Paul down and set them before them. And so essentially Claudius here says, Paul, I'm going to bring you, and we're going to talk to the Sanhedrin. Right? That was the governing body of the Jewish people. You're going to go talk to the Sanhedrin. We're going to get this thing figured out, because I'm not having any more mobs on my watch. Right? That's essentially what he's saying. Now, we won't see what happens there today. We'll look at that next week. But he brings Paul, again, unchained. He gets a whole lot more respect now that he knows he's a free-born Roman citizen. He's going to bring him to meet with the Sanhedrin. And that becomes the setting for Paul's next apologetic defense. However, as we'll see next week, it is much, much shorter. Paul gets almost no time to make a defense for himself before the Sanhedrin. Now, by way of closing, overall, what we see in this passage is the clear hand of God. Now, what's interesting about that is because it's never mentioned. It's never mentioned to us that this was God's moving Paul to be in this situation. It was God moving to be put in those chains. It was God moving to put Paul on the steps so that he could speak to this crowd. It was Paul moving the Roman soldiers to be there at that exact moment and that exact time to help Paul, to hear Paul. We don't get those notes in the text, but this is a clear passage where we see the hand of God. God wanted Paul to go to Rome. Now, he would get him there in chains, but he would still get him there. Right? Paul was going to make it to Rome. And so to ensure this, what is interesting about this passage is that he even uses a pagan government to protect Paul and to give Paul what he needed when he needed it to get to Rome, which goes to show that God is never without the means to accomplish his will. Right? If it weren't for the Romans in this particular situation, those Jews were about to kill Paul. It wasn't until the Roman soldiers showed up that Paul's life was spared. And so God used the pagan Romans against his own chosen people to protect his chosen man to get the gospel where he wanted the gospel to go. God is never without a means. If we ever think, God, I don't know what in the world you're going to do with this particular situation, God is up there just laughing because he is never without a means to accomplish his will. He can do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. Now, we may not, and I would submit often don't, know why God does what he does. We don't often get all the, in fact, I would venture to say we almost never get all the details. We almost never see the whole picture of why God does everything that he does. We almost never get to see why all the details took place exactly as they did for God's ultimate purposes to come to pass. But we can be sure that whatever happens, happens because it is in keeping with the will of God. Paul told, again, the Romans in Romans chapter 8, one of the most famous passages in all the Bible, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Now, as I like to do with this particular verse, I want to point out, never forget this. Paul says all things work together for good to them that love God. That was just as much true for Paul, who is in chains making his way to Rome, as it is true for us in our freedom. In other words, for God to work all things together for good does not necessitate a free and an easy life. Only that God's will is going to come to pass. But for Christians, we should want nothing else. If it means I'm going to be in chains and in prison for God's will to come to pass, I should be willing to be in chains and in prison for God's will to come to pass. And it should bring us great joy and contentment to be in those chains and imprisonment for God's will to come to pass. Because I only was saying this, what a comfort to the Christian. What a comfort to the Christian to know that God is working all things together for good to them that love God. To know that our sovereign, righteous, holy, and only good God is in control. What a comfort to the Christian to know that our God, our sovereign, holy, righteous God, is the one working all things together to conform to his will. What more could we want whenever we find ourselves facing difficulty or persecution or suffering shame for the cause of Christ? To know that our God is the one in control. Not the Romans, not the pagans, not the world, our God, and that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Christ is Lord. Let's pray.